In a world where royal protocols dictate every step, every gesture, every carefully measured breath, sometimes the most powerful moments happen when all the rules are forgotten. On a crisp autumn morning in London, as golden leaves dance through the air like nature's confetti, Princess Catherine would discover that the smallest acts of genuine kindness can create ripples that touch countless lives in ways no one could ever imagine. What started as a simple walk through Kensington Gardens would become a story that reminded the world why some people are born to lead with their hearts, not just their titles. This is the true story of how a future queen stopped running from her duties long enough to run towards something far more precious. A moment of pure, unscripted humanity that would reveal the woman behind the crown and change how the world sees what it truly means to be royal. The morning mist still clung to the ancient trees of Kensington Gardens as Catherine, Princess of Wales, laced up her running shoes with practiced efficiency. The digital clock on her bedside table glowed 6:15 a.m., and the palace was wrapped in that peculiar silence that only comes before the world awakens. She had learned to treasure these early morning moments, stolen fragments of normalcy in a life that belonged as much to the public as it did to herself. Catherine moved quietly through the corridors of apartment 1A, her footsteps muffled by the thick Persian rugs that had witnessed generations of royal families. The walls, adorned with priceless paintings and photographs documenting decades of public service, seemed to watch her passage with silent approval. She had come to think of these morning escapes not as rebellion against royal protocol, but as essential maintenance for her soul. The security detail was already in position when she emerged from the palace. Detective Inspector James Morrison, her longtime protection officer, gave her a knowing nod. He had been with the family for 6 years now, long enough to understand that these morning runs were not negotiable. Rain or shine, whether she had slept 3 hours or 8, Catherine would run. It was her meditation, her therapy, her connection to the woman she had been before the titles and the scrutiny and the weight of a future crown. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Morrison said, falling in a step beside her as they headed toward the garden entrance. His voice carried the professional warmth of someone who had mastered the delicate balance between protection and personal space. "Morning, James," Catherine replied, her breath visible in the cool October air. "How's Emma's piano recital practice going?" This was vintage Catherine, Morrison reflected. Even at dawn, even before her own moment of peace, she remembered the small details of other people's lives. His daughter's piano recital was still 2 weeks away, but the princess had been asking about it for months, ever since Emma had mentioned her nervousness during a family day at the palace. "She's getting there, ma'am. Still worried about the Chopin piece, but your advice about imagining she's playing for her grandmother really helped." Catherine smiled, remembering the conversation. She had shared her own pre-performance ritual, learned during her university days when she had participated in amateur dramatics. The humanizing effect of imagining friendly faces in the audience. The way personal connection could transform nervous energy into genuine expression. It was a small thing, but Catherine had learned that small things often mattered most. As they approached the main path that would take them through the heart of the gardens, Catherine felt the familiar loosening in her chest that came with this transition from princess to simply Catherine. The morning air carried the scent of autumn leaves and that particular London mixture of history and possibility that had captivated her since her university days. The gardens were nearly empty at this hour, populated only by the most dedicated joggers and the occasional dog walker making their way through the mist. Catherine had mapped several different routes over the years, varying her path to maintain some element of surprise for both security purposes and her own sense of adventure. Today felt like a day for the longer loop, the one that would take her past the Diana Memorial Playground and around the Albert Memorial before circling back toward home. She began with her usual gentle pace, allowing her body to warm gradually as her mind shifted into the meditative rhythm that made these runs so essential. The gravel path crunched softly beneath her feet, and she found herself thinking about the day ahead. A visit to a children's hospital in the afternoon, a reception for environmental charities in the evening. Important work, meaningful work, but work that required her to be on in every sense of the word. Catherine had grown up understanding that public service was both privilege and responsibility, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of living every moment in the awareness that someone might be watching, photographing, interpreting. The morning runs had become her way of reclaiming pieces of spontaneity, moments where she could simply exist without consideration of how that existence might be perceived or reported. As she found her rhythm, Catherine's thoughts drifted to a conversation she had had with her mother-in-law, Queen Camilla, the previous week. They had been discussing the challenges of maintaining authenticity in public life, and Camilla had shared something that had stayed with Catherine ever since. The moment you stop being surprised by your own capacity for genuine connection, Camilla had said, is the moment you start becoming just another person in a nice dress cutting ribbons. The public doesn't need perfect people representing them. They need real people who happen to be in positions to make a difference. The wisdom in those words had been rattling around Catherine's mind for days. She thought about her children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, and how she wanted them to understand that their eventual roles in public life were not about being elevated above others, but about being in service to others. The distinction was crucial, and she was still learning how to model it consistently. Catherine picked up her pace slightly as she approached the round pond, where the morning light was beginning to paint golden streaks across the water. A few early morning photographers were setting up equipment to capture the sunrise, and she noted Morrison's subtle hand signal to the trailing security car. The team had developed an intricate choreography over the years, maintaining their protective perimeter while allowing Catherine the illusion of solitude. She had been running for about 15 minutes when she noticed the small figure on one of the benches overlooking the pond. A little girl, probably no more than 7 or 8 years old, sat alone in the early morning mist. She was wearing what looked like a school uniform under a thin jacket, and she was crying. Catherine's first instinct was to slow down, but training kicked in. Morrison had caught sight of the child as well, and she could see him assessing the situation with a careful attention that had become second nature. Unaccompanied children in the vicinity of working royals required immediate evaluation, not out of callousness, but out of necessity. Too many well-meaning encounters had been complicated by adults with hidden agendas or situations that were not what they initially appeared to be. But as Catherine drew closer, something about the child's posture struck her as genuinely distressed rather than staged. The little girl was clutching something in her hands, something small that caught the early morning light. Catherine made a decision that would have horrified the Royal Protection training manual. She stopped running. "James," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off the child. "I need a moment." Morrison moved to object, but Catherine was already walking toward the bench. Years of working together had taught him when the princess had shifted into what the family privately called mother mode, a state that temporarily overrode all other considerations. He spoke quietly into his radio, alerting the team to the change in protocol, while positioning himself to maintain visual contact with both Catherine and their surroundings. The little girl looked up as Catherine approached, her tear-stained face showing surprise, but not fear. This was significant, Catherine noted. Children who had been coached or placed in situations typically showed different emotional responses when approached by adults. "Hello there," Catherine said gently, settling onto the bench, but leaving comfortable space between herself and the child. "I'm Catherine. What's your name?" The little girl wiped her nose with the back of her hand, studying Catherine's face with the frank curiosity that only children possess. "I'm Lily," she said in a small voice that carried a slight accent Catherine couldn't immediately place. "That's a beautiful name," Catherine replied. "I have a daughter who loves flowers. She would think your name is very special." Lily nodded solemnly, then looked down at whatever she was holding in her hands. Catherine waited, understanding instinctively that pushing for information would likely cause the child to withdraw. This was a skill she had developed through years of working with young people, the patience to allow them to reveal what they needed to in their own time. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but expectant. Catherine found herself thinking about Charlotte, who was close to this little girl's age. What would cause her daughter to be sitting alone and crying in a public place? The protective instincts that lived just beneath her public persona began to stir. "I was bringing these to my mummy," Lily said finally, opening her small hands to reveal a cluster of wildflowers, now slightly crushed from being held so tightly. "But I can't find where she is." Catherine felt her heart contract. The flowers were clearly picked rather than purchased, a small bouquet of dandelions and clover and tiny daisies that spoke of a child's earnest effort to create something beautiful for someone she loved. The kind of gift that meant everything to a mother and nothing to anyone else in the world. "Those are absolutely lovely flowers," Catherine said, and meant it completely. "Your mummy is going to treasure them. Can you tell me where you last saw her?" Lily pointed toward a cluster of trees near the memorial playground, her small hand shaking slightly. She was talking to the nice lady about the flowers, and then she said to wait right there, but that was... She paused, clearly trying to calculate time in the way children do. That was before the big hand was on the 12. Catherine glanced at her fitness watch. It was now nearly 7 o'clock. Depending on how Lily was measuring time, her mother could have been gone for anywhere from a few minutes to nearly an hour. The possibilities that flashed through Catherine's mind ranged from innocent to alarming, but she kept her expression calm and reassuring. "Well," Catherine said, "I think we should go look for her together. Would that be all right with you?" Lily nodded eagerly, sliding off the bench with the quick energy that children summon even in distress. Catherine stood as well, catching Morrison's eye and pointing in the direction of the memorial playground. He understood immediately, speaking again into his radio as the protection team adjusted to accommodate this unexpected mission. As they began walking toward the area where Lily had last seen her mother, Catherine found herself studying the child more carefully. Her school uniform was clean, but not expensive. Her shoes showed wear, but had been carefully maintained. There was nothing about Lily that suggested either neglect or affluence. Just a normal little girl in what appeared to be an abnormal situation. "Lily," Catherine said as they walked, "can you tell me about the nice lady your mummy was talking to?" "She had lots of cameras," Lily replied, "and she knew about flowers. Mummy said she was a garden lady who writes about pretty things for newspapers." Catherine felt a small chill of understanding begin to form. A journalist. Someone with cameras who had approached a woman with a child in the early morning hours in a location where Catherine was known to run. The coincidence felt too significant to ignore, but Catherine forced herself not to jump to conclusions. There were many legitimate reasons for a garden journalist to be in Kensington Gardens at dawn, especially during autumn when the seasonal changes provided optimal photographic opportunities. Still, the protective instincts that had been honed by years of public life were now fully engaged. Catherine found herself scanning their surroundings with new intensity, looking for signs of unusual activity or people who didn't seem to belong. Morrison, she noticed, was doing the same thing, his professional paranoia clearly triggered by the same concerns that were beginning to worry her. They had walked for about 5 minutes when Lily suddenly stopped and pointed toward a small grove of oak trees. "There," she said excitedly. "I see Mummy." Catherine looked in the direction Lily was pointing and saw a woman in her mid-30s standing near a large oak tree, talking animatedly to someone Catherine couldn't see clearly. The woman appeared agitated, gesturing frequently with her hands, and there was something about her body language that suggested distress rather than casual conversation. "Stay right next to me," Catherine told Lily quietly, reaching out to take the child's hand. Lily grasped her fingers trustingly, and Catherine felt the weight of that trust settle around her like a responsibility she hadn't sought but couldn't ignore. As they got closer, Catherine could make out more details of the scene. The woman who appeared to be Lily's mother was indeed talking to someone with professional photography equipment, but the conversation looked far from friendly. The photographer, a woman in her 40s with short dark hair, was holding up her hands in a gesture that could have been either explanatory or defensive. "I told you already," Catherine heard Lily's mother saying as they approached. "I don't want any pictures. I just want to find my daughter." The pieces of the situation began to click into place for Catherine. A photographer, possibly following Catherine's morning route, had approached a woman and child in the gardens. During the conversation, the child had wandered off, leaving the mother in the impossible position of needing to find her daughter while dealing with an unwanted interaction with media. Catherine felt anger beginning to build in her chest, not the hot anger that demanded immediate expression, but the cold, focused anger that came when her protective instincts were engaged. This was exactly the kind of situation that her security team worked constantly to prevent, the unintended consequences that occurred when professional obligations collided with ordinary people's lives. "Mummy," Lily called out, dropping Catherine's hand and running toward her mother. The woman turned at the sound of her daughter's voice, relief flooding her face as she knelt to catch Lily in her arms. It was only then that she looked up and saw Catherine approaching, her expression shifting from relief to shock to something that might have been embarrassment. "Oh my goodness," the woman said, standing slowly with Lily still in her arms. Your Royal Highness, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean for her." "Please don't apologize," Catherine said firmly, her attention focused entirely on the mother and child. "I'm just glad Lily is safe. She was quite worried about you." The photographer, Catherine noticed, had taken several steps back and was now attempting to blend into the background while still maintaining visual contact with the scene. Catherine turned to look at her directly, not bothering to hide her displeasure. "I think this conversation is over," Catherine said, her voice carrying the authority that came not from her title, but from her genuine anger at the situation. "These people would like some privacy." The photographer opened her mouth as if to respond, then seemed to think better of it. She gathered her equipment and began walking away, but not before Catherine caught sight of the long-lens camera that had undoubtedly been capturing the entire encounter. Catherine turned back to Lily and her mother, pushing aside her concerns about how this morning's events might be portrayed in tomorrow's newspapers. Right now, what mattered was making sure this family was genuinely all right. "Are you both okay?" Catherine asked. Lily said she'd been waiting for quite a while. The woman, who had introduced herself as Sarah Chun, nodded gratefully. "Thank you so much for finding her. I told her to stay put, but you know how children are when they get worried. I'm so sorry if this caused any trouble for you." Catherine knelt down to Lily's eye level, remembering the crushed flowers that had started this entire encounter. "Lily, do you still have those beautiful flowers for your mummy?" Lily nodded eagerly, producing the small bouquet from her jacket pocket. The flowers were even more bedraggled now, but her mother's face lit up as if she had been presented with the finest orchids. "They're perfect, sweetheart," Sarah said, accepting the flowers with the reverence they deserved. "Thank you for being such a thoughtful daughter." Catherine watched the exchange with the particular satisfaction that came from witnessing love expressed in its simplest form. This was the part of her public role that she treasured most, the moments when the machinery of royalty and protocol fell away, and she was simply present for something fundamentally human. But even as she enjoyed the sweetness of the moment, Catherine's mind was already working through the implications of what had just occurred. The photographer's presence, the timing, the location, none of it felt entirely coincidental. Tomorrow's headlines would likely focus not on a child being reunited with her mother, but on the Princess of Wales being caught in an unguarded moment. She thought about William's reaction when he learned about this, about the security briefing that would inevitably follow, about the conversations with palace communication staff about how to handle whatever narrative emerged from the photographs that had certainly been taken. But looking at Lily, still clutching her mother's hand and beaming with the particular joy that comes from crisis resolved, Catherine found she didn't regret a single moment of the morning's deviation from routine. This was why she ran in the first place, to stay connected to the part of herself that could see a crying child and simply want to help, regardless of protocol or consequences. As Sarah and Lily prepared to continue with their morning. Heading home for breakfast and the start of a school day, Catherine realized that her own morning routine had been completely derailed. She still had time for a short run before returning to the palace, but the meditative solitude she had sought was now impossible. Instead, she had something different but equally valuable, a reminder of why her public role mattered, delivered in the form of a little girl with crushed flowers and tears on her cheeks. Sometimes, Catherine reflected as she waved goodbye to the Chun family. The most important moments came not when you were looking for them, but when you were simply present enough to recognize them when they appeared. The security team regrouped around her as she prepared to continue her run, Morrison's expression carefully neutral, but his eyes asking the question he couldn't voice. Was she ready to discuss the security implications of what had just occurred? Catherine nodded slightly, understanding that this conversation would happen later in the controlled environment of the palace, where protocols existed for evaluating and learning from exactly these kinds of situations. But for now, she wanted to hold on to the simplicity of what had just transpired, the reminder that beneath all the complexity of royal life, the most meaningful moments were often the most straightforward. As she began running again, Catherine found herself thinking not about tomorrow's headlines or security briefings, but about the look in Lily's eyes when she had realized her flowers were truly appreciated. Some gifts, Catherine thought, were worth any amount of complicated aftermath. The remainder of Catherine's run passed in contemplative silence, her usual meditative rhythm disrupted by the morning's unexpected encounter. As she approached the palace gates, the familiar weight of returning to her official life settled around her shoulders like an invisible cloak. The transition from Catherine the person who helped a lost child to Catherine the Princess of Wales required a mental shifting of gears that had become automatic over the years. But today it felt more pronounced than usual. Detective Inspector Morrison kept pace beside her, his professional demeanor unchanged, but Catherine could sense the wheels turning behind his measured expression. She knew that within hours, this morning's events would be analyzed, documented, and incorporated into future security protocols. The spontaneous decision to approach an unaccompanied child would be examined from every angle, not out of criticism, but out of the genuine desire to balance Catherine's need for authentic human connection with the non-negotiable requirements of her protection. "James," Catherine said quietly as they reached the palace in trance, "I know we'll need to discuss what happened this morning." "Yes, ma'am," Morrison replied. "But if I may say so, you handled the situation exactly as we've come to expect. Your instincts were sound, and the outcome was positive for everyone involved." Catherine smiled, grateful for his understanding. Morrison had been with the family long enough to recognize that these moments of human connection were not aberrations to be prevented, but essential aspects of what made Catherine effective in her role. The challenge was always finding ways to preserve them, while maintaining the security framework that kept everyone safe. As Catherine entered the palace, she was immediately enveloped by the organized efficiency that defined her daily life. Her lady-in-waiting, Eleanor Hartwell, was waiting with a gentle smile and a thermos of tea prepared exactly as Catherine preferred it, Earl Grey with a splash of milk and no sugar. Eleanor had been with the household for 3 years, and her ability to anticipate needs while remaining nearly invisible was one of the qualities that made her invaluable. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Eleanor said, falling in a step beside Catherine as they headed toward the private apartments. "I've laid out the briefing materials for this afternoon's hospital visit, and the morning papers are on your desk, as usual." Catherine nodded her thanks, her mind already shifting to the official duties that would fill the rest of her day. But as they walked through the familiar corridors, she found herself thinking about Sarah Chun and little Lily, wondering how their own morning was progressing. Were they sitting down to breakfast now? Was Lily telling her father about the nice lady who helped her find her mother? The ordinariness of their lives suddenly felt both precious and distant. The morning newspapers were indeed waiting on her desk, spread out in the careful arrangement that allowed her to quickly scan the major headlines and stories. Catherine had developed the ability to process media coverage efficiently, understanding that staying informed about public perception was part of her job while not allowing it to define her sense of self-worth. Today, however, she found herself looking more carefully than usual, wondering if any early edition had managed to capture and report on the garden encounter. The front pages were dominated by political news and international events, with the usual mixture of serious journalism and celebrity gossip that characterized the British press. Catherine was relieved to see no mention of her morning run, but she knew that modern media moved quickly, and digital platforms might already be carrying stories that wouldn't appear in print editions until tomorrow. Her personal secretary, Michael Davies, appeared in the doorway with the careful timing that indicated he had been watching for her return. Michael had worked for the royal household for over a decade, and his ability to manage Catherine's schedule while remaining sensitive to the human elements of her role had made him indispensable. "Ma'am," he said, "I wanted to confirm the timeline for this afternoon. The hospital visit is scheduled to begin at 2 o'clock, with a brief meet and greet with senior staff before moving to the children's wards. The communications team has emphasized that several of the young patients have specifically requested to meet you." Catherine felt the familiar flutter of anticipation that came before visits with seriously ill children. These were among the most meaningful aspects of her public role, but also the most emotionally challenging. The courage and resilience she witnessed in pediatric wards never failed to humble her, while simultaneously reminding her of how fortunate she was to have healthy children of her own. "Has there been any change in the patient list?" Catherine asked, settling into her desk chair and reaching for the briefing folder. "I want to make sure I'm prepared for any specific interests or concerns the children might have." Michael consulted his tablet. Dr. Williams mentioned that young James Morrison, no relation to Detective Inspector Morrison, he added with a slight smile, has been asking if you might be willing to hear about his science project. Apparently, he's been working on something related to plant growth while he's been in hospital. Catherine made a note in her folder. Children who were facing serious illness often threw themselves into creative or academic projects with intensity that amazed the adults around them. She had learned to prepare not just for conversations about their medical situations, but for discussions about their passions, their studies, their dreams for the future. These conversations required her to be genuinely present and engaged, not just sympathetically nodding. The morning continued with its usual rhythm of briefings, correspondence review, and preparation for upcoming engagements. Catherine had long ago mastered the art of compartmentalizing her attention, fully engaging with each task while maintaining awareness of the larger picture of her responsibilities. But today, she found her thoughts drifting periodically to the image of Lily's small hands carefully holding those crushed wildflowers. Around 11 o'clock, Eleanor appeared with Catherine's mobile phone and a slightly puzzled expression. "Ma'am, you've received an unusual message through the official channels. A Ms. Sarah Chun has requested permission to send you a personal thank you note. Apparently, she encountered you this morning during your run." Catherine felt a warm surprise. She had not expected to hear from the Chun family again, and the fact that Sarah had taken the time to reach out through proper channels showed both thoughtfulness and respect for protocol. What would be the appropriate way to respond? Catherine asked. Eleanor consulted her own notes. The communications office suggests that a brief acknowledgement would be appropriate, if you wish to respond at all. They've noted that there don't appear to be any media implications to the encounter, which is somewhat unusual for an unplanned public interaction. This last comment caught Catherine's attention. No media implications? Nothing has appeared in any of our monitoring systems, Eleanor confirmed. No social media posts, no paparazzi photographs, no inquiries from journalists. It appears to have been a genuinely private moment. Catherine felt a small surge of gratitude, both for the Chun family's discretion and for whatever circumstance had kept the encounter away from public scrutiny. It was becoming increasingly rare for any public interaction to remain private, and she had grown accustomed to seeing even the most innocent encounters transformed into headlines and speculation. "Please let Sarah know that I was happy to help," Catherine said, And perhaps, would it be possible to include a small note for Lily? Something she could keep? Eleanor smiled, understanding immediately. I'll coordinate with the communications office. A personal note for a child would be entirely appropriate, especially given the circumstances. As Eleanor left to make the arrangements, Catherine found herself thinking about the nature of genuine human connection in her increasingly connected, but often impersonal world. The morning's encounter with Lily and Sarah had reminded her of something she sometimes forgot in the midst of official duties and public appearances, that her role was ultimately about service to real people facing real situations, not abstract concepts or political positions. The lunch hour brought a brief respite in her schedule, and Catherine used the time to review the detailed briefings for the afternoon's hospital visit. She read carefully about each child she would meet, their medical situations, their families, their particular interests or concerns. This preparation was essential not just for conducting effective visits, but for ensuring that she could engage authentically with each young person as an individual rather than as a representative of their illness. Young James Morrison's file was particularly detailed. At age 10, he was undergoing treatment for a rare autoimmune condition that had kept him hospitalized for 6 weeks. During his stay, he had become fascinated with the small garden visible from his window and had convinced the nursing staff to help him conduct experiments with bean plants and different types of soil. His science project had grown into a comprehensive study that impressed his doctors and provided him with a sense of purpose during his treatment. Catherine made additional notes about plant biology, remembering her own childhood fascination with gardening and the lessons her mother had taught her about the patience and faith required to nurture growing things. She wanted to be prepared for a genuine conversation about James's discoveries, not just polite interest in his hobby. At 1:30, Catherine's protection team and communications staff gathered for the final briefing before departure. The hospital visit would involve multiple stops, each carefully choreographed to maximize meaningful interaction while maintaining security and medical protocols. Catherine had learned to navigate these complex logistics while keeping her focus on the human element that made such visits worthwhile. The children's ward is particularly excited about today's visit, said Dr. Williams, who had arrived to accompany the party to the hospital. Several of the young patients have been preparing for weeks, and the nursing staff reports that anticipation of the visit has been a significant positive factor in their treatment attitudes. Catherine nodded, feeling the familiar combination of honor and responsibility that came with knowing that her presence could have genuine impact on young people facing serious challenges. She had learned that children dealing with illness often possessed remarkable clarity about what mattered most in life, and their perspectives had frequently provided her with insights that influenced her approach to her public role. The journey to the hospital passed quickly, with Catherine using the travel time to review her notes one final time and mentally prepare for the emotional intensity that always accompanied visits with seriously ill children. She had developed strategies over the years for maintaining her composure and effectiveness in situations that could be heartbreaking, but each visit still required conscious preparation. St. Mary's Children's Hospital represented the best of modern pediatric care, combining cutting-edge medical technology with an environment designed to support the emotional and psychological needs of young patients and their families. Catherine had visited numerous times over the years, and she was always impressed by the dedication of the staff and the resilience of the children they served. The greeting committee included senior medical staff, hospital administrators, and representatives from the various charitable organizations that supported the hospital's work. Catherine moved through the introductory conversations with practiced ease, but her attention was already focused on the children's ward and the young patients who were waiting for her arrival. The first stop was the main children's ward, where a group of young patients who were able to leave their rooms had gathered in the common area. Catherine was immediately struck by the atmosphere of excited anticipation, but also by the visible signs of serious illness that marked each child's experience. Some were connected to portable medical equipment. Others showed the effects of intensive treatment, but all were clearly thrilled by the prospect of this special visit. Catherine had learned that the key to successful hospital visits was to follow the children's lead, allowing them to determine the tone and content of interactions rather than imposing her own agenda. Some children wanted to talk about their illness and treatment. Others prefer to discuss their hobbies or school projects, and still others simply enjoyed the novelty of meeting someone they had seen on television. The first child she met, 8-year-old Emma Thompson, was eager to show Catherine an elaborate drawing she had created depicting the hospital staff as superheroes. Each nurse, doctor, and therapist was portrayed with unique powers related to their role in patient care, and the level of detail and creativity was remarkable. "This is absolutely wonderful," Catherine said, studying the drawing carefully. "I can see that you've thought very carefully about what makes each person special. Can you tell me about this character here?" Emma beamed with pride as she explained that the figure Catherine was pointing to represented her favorite night nurse, who had been given the superpower of making bad dreams go away. The conversation that followed revealed not just Emma's artistic talent, but her sophisticated understanding of the different ways the hospital staff supported patients beyond just medical treatment. As Catherine moved through the ward, she found herself having similar conversations with each child, discussions that revealed the depth of insight that serious illness often brought to young people. They spoke about hope and fear, about the small victories that mattered most during treatment, about their dreams for the future, and their appreciation for the people who were helping them through difficult times. When she reached James Morrison's room, Catherine was immediately struck by the elaborate science project that had taken over most of his available space. Bean plants in various stages of growth were arranged near the window, each carefully labeled with variables being tested. Charts and graphs covered one wall, documenting growth rates, soil conditions, and environmental factors with the precision of a professional research study. "Your Royal Highness," James said, standing carefully beside his bed, "would you like to see what I've discovered about plant growth acceleration?" For the next 20 minutes, Catherine found herself engaged in one of the most fascinating conversations about plant biology she had ever experienced. James had not only conducted careful experiments, but had developed theories about optimal growing conditions that demonstrated genuine scientific thinking. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Catherine found herself asking questions that led to even more detailed explanations. "The most interesting discovery," James explained, showing Catherine a chart that tracked growth rates under different conditions, "is that the plants that received the most consistent attention grew fastest, even when their soil conditions weren't perfect. I think plants can sense when someone cares about them." Catherine paused, struck by the profundity of this observation from a 10-year-old facing his own serious medical challenges. "That's a remarkable insight, James. Do you think the same thing might be true for people?" James nodded seriously. "I think that's why I'm getting better faster than the doctors expected. Everyone here cares so much about helping us get well. It makes a difference when you know people are paying attention to you." The conversation continued for several more minutes, but Catherine found her mind returning repeatedly to James's observation about the power of consistent attention and care. It struck her as a perfect metaphor for the kind of public service she aspired to provide, not just occasional grand gestures, but steady, reliable attention to the things that mattered most to the people she served. As the hospital visit continued, Catherine met with more children, each interaction reinforcing her sense of the privilege and responsibility that came with her role. These young people, facing challenges that would overwhelm many adults, consistently demonstrated courage, wisdom, and generosity of spirit that humbled her and reminded her of why her public work mattered. The final stop of the visit was a meeting with parents and family members, many of whom had been living at the hospital for weeks or months while their children received treatment. These conversations were often the most emotionally challenging part of hospital visits, as Catherine witnessed firsthand the strain that serious childhood illness placed on entire families. One mother, whose daughter was undergoing treatment for leukemia, spoke about the isolation that came with spending months in hospital corridors. You lose touch with normal life, she explained. It means everything when someone from the outside world takes the time to really understand what we're going through. Another father described the financial pressures that accompanied his son's treatment, despite the NHS covering medical costs. Time off work, traveling to specialists, the emotional toll on the whole family. It affects everything. But days like today remind us that people care about what happens to our children. Catherine listened carefully to each story, understanding that her role in these moments was not to provide solutions, but to bear witness to experiences that often went unrecognized by the broader public. These families were fighting battles that required not just medical intervention, but community support, and her presence represented that broader community's investment in their children's well-being. As the visit concluded, Catherine found herself thinking about the connections between her morning encounter with Lily and Sarah Chun and the afternoon's conversations with hospital families. Both situations had involved parents and children facing unexpected challenges, and both had demonstrated the profound impact that genuine attention and care could have on people in vulnerable situations. The drive back to the palace provided time for reflection on the day's experiences. Catherine had long ago learned that the most effective public service required her to remain emotionally open to the people she met, while also developing the resilience to process difficult situations without becoming overwhelmed. Today's hospital visit had been particularly rich with meaningful connections, but it had also been emotionally demanding. Eleanor was waiting when Catherine returned to the palace, with a gentle smile that suggested good news. "Ma'am, I have something that might interest you." The thank you note from the Chun family arrived this afternoon. Catherine accepted the envelope with curiosity. Inside was a brief, handwritten note from Sarah Chun expressing gratitude for the morning's assistance, along with a separate piece of paper covered with a child's careful drawing. Lily had created a picture of two figures holding hands near some trees, with a small bouquet of flowers prominently featured. At the bottom, in letters that clearly represented significant effort, was written, "Thank you, Princess Catherine." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes as she studied Lily's drawing. The image captured something essential about their morning encounter. Not the complicated protocol considerations or security implications, but the simple human connection between someone who needed help and someone who was able to provide it. "There's also this," Eleanor said, producing a small envelope marked for Lily in Catherine's handwriting. "Your note for the little girl." Catherine had written carefully about the beauty of Lily's flower gift and the importance of children who notice and care about the people they love. She had tried to capture something that a 7-year-old would treasure, while also encouraging the qualities that had made Lily's gesture so meaningful. As evening approached, and Catherine prepared for the environmental charity reception that would conclude her official day, she found herself thinking about the unexpected threads that had connected her morning run with her afternoon hospital visit. Both experiences had reminded her that her role was ultimately about recognizing and responding to the fundamental human need for connection and care. The morning's encounter with a lost child and the afternoon's conversations with young patients and their families were separated by the formal machinery of royal protocol and public service, but they were united by something much simpler and more profound. They represented moments when the abstractions of public duty became concrete through genuine human interaction. As Catherine prepared to transition into her evening role as patron of environmental organizations, she carried with her the insights that had emerged from the day's experiences. The power of consistent attention that James Morrison had observed in his plant experiments. The profound impact of genuine care that she had witnessed in hospital corridors. The simple beauty of a child's crushed flowers offered with love. These were the experiences that made Catherine's public role meaningful. The moments that reminded her why the complicated machinery of royal service existed in the first place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but today had provided exactly the kind of authentic human connection that made all the protocol and preparation worthwhile. The environmental charity reception that evening took place at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, a location that Catherine had specifically requested when planning began months earlier. Something about spending the day thinking about flowers, from Lily's crushed wildflowers to James Morrison's carefully tended bean plants, had made the choice feel particularly meaningful. As Catherine's car approached the iconic Palm House, its Victorian glass curves illuminated against the darkening sky, she found herself reflecting on the day's unexpected coherence. What had begun as a routine morning run had evolved into a series of connected experiences that seemed to reinforce a central theme: the profound importance of nurturing and care, whether applied to lost children, hospitalized patients, or the natural world itself. The reception was being hosted jointly by several environmental organizations, including the Royal Horticultural Society, the Eden Project, and a newer charity focused on urban gardening initiatives in underserved communities. Catherine had been patron of environmental causes for several years, but tonight's event was particularly significant because it would announce a new initiative that combined her interests in child welfare and environmental education. Eleanor approached as Catherine's car came to a stop, carrying the evening briefing folder and wearing the slightly tense expression that indicated a last-minute complication. "Ma'am, there's been a small change to this evening's program. The organizers have asked if you might be willing to meet with a group of young environmental advocates who arrived unexpectedly this afternoon. Apparently, they've traveled quite far to attend tonight's event." Catherine accepted the revised schedule with interest rather than concern. Her years of public service had taught her that the most meaningful moments often arose from unplanned deviations from official programs. "What can you tell me about these young people?" "They're students from various secondary schools across London," Eleanor explained as they walked toward the entrance. "They've organized independently to attend tonight's event because they wanted to present some kind of petition or proposal related to school gardening programs. The organizers were impressed enough with their initiative to accommodate them." Catherine smiled, thinking about the morning's encounter with Lily and the afternoon's conversation with James about his plant experiments. The day seemed to be offering a final lesson about the power of young people to surprise adults with their insight and determination. The reception was already in full swing when Catherine entered the Palm House, the soaring glass structure filled with the soft murmur of conversation and the exotic perfume of tropical plants. The guest list included a carefully curated mixture of environmental scientists, policymakers, celebrity advocates, and major donors, all united by their commitment to conservation and sustainability initiatives. Catherine moved through the initial greeting process with practiced ease, but she found her attention drawn repeatedly toward a small group of teenagers who were clustered near one of the information displays. Their school uniforms and nervous energy marked them as the unexpected additions to the evening's guest list, and Catherine was impressed by their determination to engage seriously with the environmental information being presented. Dr. Margaret Thornton, director of the Royal Botanic Gardens, approached with a warm smile that had made her one of Catherine's favorite collaborators on environmental initiatives. "Your Royal Highness, thank you so much for choosing Kew for tonight's announcement. I think you'll find that the location provides perfect context for what we're hoping to accomplish." Catherine nodded, admiring the way the evening light filtered through the Palm House's glass panels, creating patterns that shifted across the gathered guests and exotic vegetation. "This building has always felt to me like a symbol of what's possible when human creativity works in harmony with natural beauty," she replied. "It seems like the ideal setting for launching a program that brings environmental education directly to young people." The new initiative that would be announced tonight represented months of planning and coordination between multiple organizations. The Growing Minds program would establish school gardens in urban areas with limited access to green space, combining environmental education with practical gardening skills and community building. Catherine had been particularly excited about this project because it addressed multiple areas of her interest simultaneously. As the formal program began, Catherine took her place at the podium, looking out over the assembled guests and feeling the familiar combination of responsibility and privilege that came with using her platform to advocate for causes she believed in. The Palm House provided a dramatic backdrop for her remarks, its towering trees and vibrant flowers serving as living examples of what thoughtful cultivation could achieve. Tonight, Catherine began, we gather in a place that represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, the creation of an environment where diverse forms of life can flourish together. The Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew stands as proof that when we combine scientific knowledge with genuine care for the natural world, we can create something that benefits everyone. She spoke about the Growing Minds initiative, explaining how school gardens could serve as outdoor classrooms where children learned not just about plants and ecology, but about responsibility, patience, and the satisfaction that comes from nurturing something from seed to harvest. Catherine's remarks drew heavily on conversations she had with educators and child development experts, but they were also informed by her own experiences as a mother watching her children discover the wonder of growing things. Children have an innate understanding of the connections between care and growth, Catherine continued, thinking unconsciously about young James Morrison's observation about plants thriving under consistent attention. When we give them opportunities to participate in that process directly, we help them develop not just environmental awareness, but empathy and responsibility that will serve them throughout their lives. The audience responded enthusiastically to the Growing Minds announcement, particularly the news that the program would begin with pilot projects in 20 schools across London, with plans for expansion based on the initial results. Catherine was pleased to see that the group of young people who had arrived unexpectedly were taking careful notes, their earlier nervousness replaced by obvious excitement about the possibilities being described. After the formal presentations concluded, Catherine moved into the reception portion of the evening, engaging in the numerous individual conversations that made such events both meaningful and exhausting. She spoke with scientists about recent research on urban gardening benefits, with policymakers about incorporating environmental education into national curricula, and with potential donors about funding opportunities for expanded programming. But it was her conversation with a group of student advocates that proved most memorable. When Catherine approached them near the end of the evening, she was immediately impressed by their poise and preparation. They had clearly spent considerable time researching both her environmental work and the evening's initiatives, and their questions demonstrated genuine understanding of the complexities involved in creating effective educational programs. "Your Royal Highness," said a young woman who appeared to be the group's informal spokesperson, "we wanted to thank you for including school gardening in your environmental work. We've seen firsthand how much difference these programs can make." Catherine was intrigued. "Can you tell me about your own experiences?" The conversation that followed revealed that these students had traveled from schools that had already implemented small-scale gardening programs, often with minimal official support and limited resources. Their initiative in attending tonight's event represented their determination to advocate for expanded support for these efforts. "At our school," explained a young man whose obvious passion for the subject reminded Catherine of James Morrison's enthusiasm for his plant experiments. "We started with just a few containers on the roof. But within a year, we had students from every year group involved, and the vegetables we grew were being used in the school kitchen. It changed how people thought about food, about the environment, about what school could be." Another student added, "The amazing thing was how it brought different groups of students together. People who never talked to each other before were working side by side, sharing what they learned, helping each other solve problems." Catherine listened with growing excitement as the students described outcomes that perfectly aligned with the goals of the Growing Minds initiative. Their firsthand experiences provided evidence that well-designed school gardening programs could indeed deliver the multiple benefits that tonight's research presentations had promised. "We've brought something for you," the first young woman said, producing a carefully prepared folder from her bag. "It's a proposal for how programs like Growing Minds could be supported by student advocacy networks. We think young people should be partners in this work, not just recipients of it." Catherine accepted the folder with genuine interest, impressed by the thoughtfulness that had clearly gone into its preparation. The students had identified themselves not just as beneficiaries of environmental education programs, but as potential leaders and advocates who could help ensure such initiatives succeeded and expanded. As the evening concluded and Catherine prepared to return to the palace, she found herself thinking about the day's arc from early morning encounter with a lost child to late evening conversations with passionate young environmentalists. Each interaction had reinforced her growing conviction that young people possessed insights and capabilities that were often underestimated by the adults responsible for creating programs and policies on their behalf. The drive back to Kensington Palace provided time to process the day's experiences and their implications for her ongoing work. Catherine had always believed that her role was most effective when it could bridge different worlds, bringing attention to important causes while remaining grounded in authentic human experience. Today it offered multiple examples of how that bridging function could work in practice. Eleanor, riding in the passenger seat, was reviewing notes from the evening's conversations. "Ma'am, several of tonight's attendees mentioned that they had heard about your encounter with a lost child this morning. Apparently, word has spread through informal networks, though it doesn't seem to have reached the media." Catherine was surprised. She had assumed that the morning's incident had remained private, limited to the immediate participants and her own staff. "What are people saying?" "Nothing inappropriate," Eleanor assured her. Dr. Thornton mentioned that someone at the hospital visit this afternoon had heard about it from a friend who works in Kensington Gardens. The general response seems to be admiration for your instinct to help, rather than criticism of any protocol deviations. This informal network of positive communication reminded Catherine of something she had observed repeatedly throughout her years of public service: that genuine acts of kindness and connection often generated their own organic publicity, spreading through communities in ways that formal public relations efforts couldn't replicate. The fact that her morning encounter with Lily and Sarah Chun was being discussed approvingly by people who worked in children's welfare and environmental conservation felt like validation that the incident had indeed reflected her authentic values. Back at the palace, Catherine settled into her private study to review correspondence and prepare for the following day's schedule. But first, she wanted to examine the proposal that the student environmental advocates had presented. Their folder contained not just ideas about youth involvement in gardening programs, but a sophisticated analysis of how such initiatives could be scaled and sustained through peer-to-peer networks. The students had identified several key insights that had not been fully addressed in the official Growing Minds planning. They argued that programs imposed entirely by adults, no matter how well-intentioned, often failed to generate the student ownership necessary for long-term success. They proposed instead a model that would train young people as environmental education leaders, empowering them to establish and maintain school gardens with adult support rather than adult direction. Catherine was impressed by the sophistication of their thinking, but also by the underlying assumption that young people could and should be trusted with significant responsibility for initiatives that affected their own education. It reminded her of the conversation with James Morrison about plants thriving under consistent attention. Perhaps students would be more invested in environmental programs they had helped design and implement themselves. The proposal also included specific recommendations for connecting school gardening programs with broader community development initiatives. The students had recognized that isolated school projects, no matter how successful, would have limited impact compared to efforts that connected educational institutions with local food systems, environmental organizations, and community advocacy groups. As Catherine read through the detailed recommendations, she found herself thinking about the potential for expanding the Growing Minds initiative beyond what had been announced tonight. The students' proposal suggested possibilities for a truly comprehensive approach to environmental education that could have significant impact on both individual development and community resilience. She made notes about following up with the organizations involved in tonight's event, exploring whether the student recommendations could be incorporated into the program design before implementation began. Catherine had learned that the most successful royal patronage involved not just lending her name and presence to worthy causes, but actively working to improve the effectiveness of the initiative she supported. The day's final task was reviewing the next morning's schedule, which included a breakfast meeting with education policy advisors and a visit to a primary school in East London. Catherine realized that both appointments would provide opportunities to discuss the ideas she had encountered throughout the day, from James Morrison's insights about consistent care to the student advocate's proposals for youth leadership in environmental education. As she prepared for bed, Catherine reflected on the unexpected coherence that had emerged from what had begun as a routine Tuesday. The morning's encounter with a lost child holding wildflowers had led to an afternoon with young hospital patients learning about plant biology, which had concluded with an evening discussion of how gardening programs could transform educational experiences. Each conversation had reinforced the central importance of nurturing and attention, whether directed toward individual children, specific plants, or broader environmental and educational systems. Catherine had been reminded repeatedly that the most effective care was not intermittent grand gestures, but consistent, thoughtful attention that allowed people and places to flourish according to their own potential. The day had also demonstrated the value of remaining open to unplanned encounters and unexpected insights. From Lily's tears on a garden bench to the student advocate's sophisticated policy proposals, the most meaningful moments had arisen from Catherine's willingness to deviate from schedule and engage authentically with situations as they presented themselves. As Catherine settled into sleep, she found herself thinking about tomorrow's school visit and the opportunities it would provide to continue exploring the themes that had emerged so prominently today. She wanted to observe firsthand how young people responded to hands-on environmental education and to test some of the ideas that the evening's conversations had generated. But mostly, Catherine felt grateful for a day that had reminded her so clearly why her public role mattered. The privilege of her position was not just the ability to attend elegant receptions or meet with important officials, but the opportunity to witness and support the countless ways that ordinary people, children with wildflowers, hospital patients with bean plants, teenagers with environmental proposals, were working to make their communities better. These are the experiences that kept Catherine grounded in the human reality behind policy discussions and charitable initiatives. Tomorrow would bring new encounters and different challenges, but today had provided exactly the kind of authentic connection that made all the protocol and preparation feel worthwhile. The last thing Catherine saw before sleep was Lily's thank you drawing, propped on her bedside table as a reminder of how much could be accomplished when someone simply took the time to notice that another person needed help. It was, she reflected, a perfect metaphor for the kind of public service she hoped to provide throughout her life. Wednesday morning arrived with the crisp clarity that sometimes follows days of particular significance. Catherine woke naturally, without an alarm, feeling the deep satisfaction that came from sleep earned through meaningful work. The previous day's experiences had settled into memory with unusual vividness, each encounter retaining its emotional texture while also connecting to larger patterns of understanding about her role and responsibilities. The breakfast meeting with education policy advisors was scheduled for 8 o'clock in the palace's morning room, a space that Catherine particularly appreciated for its combination of formality and warmth. The room's large windows faced east, filling the space with natural light that made even serious policy discussions feel more optimistic and collaborative. Catherine arrived to find her guests already engaged in animated conversation about recent developments in environmental education policy. Dr. Amanda Richardson from the Department of Education, Professor David Chun from the Institute of Educational Research, and Maria Santos from the National Union of Teachers represented different perspectives on how environmental learning could be effectively integrated into national curricula. Your Royal Highness, Dr. Richardson said as Catherine joined the group, "We were just discussing the response to yesterday evening's Growing Minds announcement. The initial feedback has been remarkably positive, particularly from schools that have already implemented similar programs on smaller scales. Catherine settled in her chair, accepting a cup of tea from Eleanor while thinking about the student advocates she had met the previous evening. I'm particularly interested in hearing about programs that have achieved student ownership and leadership. Yesterday, I met some remarkable young people who had very sophisticated ideas about how environmental education could be student-driven rather than simply student-targeted. Professor Chen leaned forward with obvious interest. That's precisely what our research suggests is most effective for long-term behavior change. When students see themselves as environmental leaders rather than just environmental learners, they develop the kind of deep engagement that persists beyond their school years. The conversation that followed explored the practical challenges of implementing student-led environmental programs within existing educational structures. Maria Santos raised important questions about teacher training, curriculum integration, and the additional resources that would be required to support expanded environmental education effectively. The reality, Maria explained, is that many teachers are already overwhelmed with existing curriculum requirements. Any new initiative, no matter how valuable, needs to be designed in ways that support rather than burden classroom educators. Catherine listened carefully to these practical concerns, understanding that successful advocacy required attention to implementation realities as well as inspiring goals. She thought about James Morrison's observation that plants thrived under consistent rather than intermittent attention. Perhaps educational programs require the same kind of sustainable, long-term commitment rather than enthusiastic but brief initiatives. What if we approached this differently? Catherine suggested, thinking about the previous evening's student proposals. Instead of asking teachers to take on additional responsibilities, what if we focused on training students to become environmental education leaders who could support classroom teachers while developing their own skills? Dr. Richardson looked intrigued. That would require a significant shift in how we think about student roles in education. Most current models position students as recipients of adult expertise rather than participants in creating educational experiences. But research supports exactly the kind of peer education model, Professor Chen added. Students often learn more effectively from slightly older peers than from adult instructors, particularly in subjects that require behavior change rather than just information transfer. Catherine felt a surge of excitement as the conversation began to explore possibilities that aligned with insights from her previous day's encounters. The idea of positioning young people as environmental educators rather than just environmental education recipients could address multiple challenges simultaneously while honoring the capabilities that she had observed in students like James Morrison and the environmental advocates at Kew Gardens. The breakfast meeting concluded with plans for a working group that would develop specific proposals for integrating student leadership into the Growing Minds initiative. Catherine was pleased that the policy experts were taking seriously the ideas that had emerged from her informal conversations with young people, and she looked forward to seeing how professional educational planning could incorporate the insights that students themselves had provided. The morning's second engagement was a visit to Oakwood Primary School in East London, where Catherine would observe an existing gardening program and meet with students, teachers, and parents involved in environmental education initiatives. The school had been selected specifically because it represented the kind of urban, diverse community that the Growing Minds program hoped to serve. The journey to East London provided Catherine with time to review briefing materials about Oakwood Primary and its innovative approach to outdoor education. The school served a student population that was primarily from immigrant families, with over 20 different languages spoken by students and their families. Despite limited resources and significant economic challenges, Oakwood had developed one of the most successful urban gardening programs in London. Eleanor accompanied Catherine on the journey, using the travel time to review the morning's correspondence and prepare for upcoming engagements. "Ma'am," she said, "I have an update about the Chun family from yesterday morning. Apparently, young Lily has been telling everyone at school about meeting you, and her teacher has asked if there might be an opportunity for the class to visit one of the royal gardens for an educational program." Catherine smiled, touched by this evidence that her brief encounter with Lily was continuing to generate positive outcomes. That sounds like exactly the kind of connection between royal resources and educational opportunities that we should be encouraging. Can we explore possibilities with the education team? Eleanor made a note about following up on the educational visit request, and Catherine found herself thinking about how yesterday's unplanned encounter was evolving into an opportunity to benefit an entire classroom of children. It was another example of how authentic human connections often generated their own expansion into larger positive outcomes. Oakwood Primary School occupied a converted Victorian building that had been thoughtfully adapted to serve the needs of a modern, diverse student population. The school's entrance displayed student artwork celebrating the many cultures represented in the school community, and Catherine was immediately impressed by the obvious pride that students took in their educational environment. Head teacher Mrs. Patricia Williams greeted Catherine with the warm professionalism that marked effective educational leaders. "Your Royal Highness, we're absolutely delighted to share our gardening program with you. The children have been preparing for your visit for weeks, and they're bursting with excitement to show you what they've accomplished." Catherine was led first to the school's main garden area, a space that had been created by converting a portion of the playground into raised beds, greenhouse areas, and outdoor classroom spaces. Despite the urban setting and limited space, the garden was remarkably productive and beautiful, clearly representing significant collaborative effort between students, teachers, and families. The first group of students Catherine met were Year 3 children, 7 and 8-year-olds who had been working on a project about food systems and cultural diversity. Each child had planted vegetables that were important to their family's traditional cooking, creating a garden that represented the international character of their school community. "This is my grandmother's okra," explained 8-year-old Amara, gesturing proudly toward plants that were thriving despite the London climate. "She taught me how to plant it the way they do in Nigeria, and now we're teaching other children so they can grow it too." Catherine was fascinated by the way the gardening program had become a vehicle for cultural exchange and family engagement. Students were not just learning about plant biology, but about the food traditions that connected them to their heritage while also sharing those traditions with classmates from different backgrounds. 9-year-old Marcus showed Catherine the section of garden where students were experimenting with different growing techniques, comparing traditional soil beds with hydroponic systems and container gardens. "We want to figure out the best ways to grow food in small spaces," he explained with the seriousness of a professional researcher, "because most of us live in flats where there's not much room for gardens." The sophistication of the students' thinking reminded Catherine of her conversation with James Morrison about plant growth and consistent attention. These children were not just following instructions about gardening, but developing their own hypotheses and conducting genuine experiments to test their ideas. As Catherine moved through the garden areas, she was struck by the obvious sense of ownership and responsibility that students felt for their projects. Unlike many school activities that were clearly teacher-directed, this gardening program had evolved into something that students were leading and expanding according to their own interests and family connections. "The remarkable thing," Mrs. Williams explained as they walked between garden beds, "is how the program has strengthened connections between home and school. Parents who might have felt intimidated by traditional school involvement have become enthusiastic contributors when they can share their own knowledge about growing food." Catherine observed this family engagement firsthand when she met with a group of parents who had gathered to discuss their involvement in the gardening program. The parents represented the diversity of the school community, but they were united by their enthusiasm for their children's environmental education and their appreciation for how the program honored different cultural approaches to growing food. "My daughter used to hate coming to school," said Mrs. Patel, whose daughter Priya was in Year 4. "But now she can't wait to check on her plants and share what she's learning with the other children. The garden has given her confidence and helped her feel proud of what our family knows about growing things." Mr. Kowalski, whose son was experimenting with companion planting techniques learned from his grandfather in Poland, added, This program has helped us connect our family history with our children's education in ways that never happened before. It's brought different generations together around shared knowledge. These conversations reinforce Catherine's growing conviction that effective environmental education required approaches that honored the knowledge and experience that students and families brought to school, rather than treating them as empty vessels to be filled with expert information. The Oakwood Garden program had succeeded precisely because it positioned diverse cultural knowledge as an asset rather than an obstacle. The final part of Catherine's school visit involved observing a class session where students were preparing presentations about their gardening projects for younger children. Catherine was impressed by the ease with which 8- and 9-year-olds had assumed teaching responsibilities, explaining complex concepts about plant nutrition and growth cycles to 5- and 6-year-old classmates. When you plant seeds, 10-year-old Sophia explained to a group of fascinated younger children, you have to think about what the plant needs to be healthy. Just like people need good food and care and attention, plants need the right soil and water and light. If you give them what they need consistently, they'll grow strong and give you food to share. Catherine found herself thinking about the parallels between Sophia's explanation and her own reflections about public service and human relationships. The consistency and attention that plants require to thrive were similar to what effective community building and individual development required, sustained commitment rather than sporadic intervention. After the formal school visit concluded, Catherine spent time in less structured conversation with students, teachers, and parents about their experiences with environmental education and their hopes for programs like Growing Minds. These informal discussions often provided insights that formal presentations couldn't capture. One conversation particularly stayed with Catherine. A group of older students, 10- and 11-year-olds who had been involved in the gardening program for several years, spoke about how their environmental awareness had influenced their family's choices about food, transportation, and waste management. When you start growing your own food, explained 11-year-old David, you begin to think differently about where all food comes from and how much work it takes. It makes you not want to waste things, and it makes you want to make choices that don't hurt the environment. Another student, 10-year-old Zara, added, my little sister sees me taking care of plants, and now she wants to take care of things too. Environmental education isn't just about the kids in the program. It spreads to whole families and makes everyone think more about taking care of the world. These observations about the ripple effects of environmental education align perfectly with Catherine's own experience of how individual acts of care and attention could generate expanding circles of positive impact. Yesterday's encounter with Lily and the crushed wildflowers had led to conversations about hospital gardening programs, environmental education policy, and now to witnessing firsthand how school gardening programs were strengthening entire communities. The journey back to Kensington Palace provided time for Catherine to process the morning's experiences and their implications for her ongoing advocacy work. Eleanor used the travel time to debrief about specific commitments that had emerged from the school visit and to plan follow-up activities that could support Oakwood Primary's continued development. The education policy advisors will be particularly interested in what you observed about peer teaching and family engagement, Eleanor noted. Those seem to be the factors that distinguish successful programs from well-intentioned efforts that don't achieve lasting impact. Catherine nodded, thinking about how to articulate the insights that had emerged from her conversations with students and parents. What struck me most was how the program succeeded by building on what people already knew and cared about, rather than try to replace their existing knowledge with expert information. The children became teachers because they were sharing genuine discoveries and family wisdom, not just repeating lessons they had memorized. This observation felt significant for Catherine's broader understanding of effective public service. The most successful initiatives she had encountered were those that recognized and utilized the existing strengths within communities, rather than imposing external solutions that ignored local knowledge and capabilities. Back at the palace, Catherine settled into her afternoon schedule of correspondence review and preparation for upcoming engagements. But she found her attention repeatedly returning to the connections between the past 2 days' experiences and their implications for how she approached her role as a royal advocate for various causes. The encounter with Lily and the wildflowers had reminded her that the most meaningful public service often arose from simple human responsiveness to immediate needs. The hospital visit had demonstrated how genuine attention and interest could have profound impact on people facing serious challenges. The environmental reception had shown how individual passion could generate sophisticated collaborative initiatives. And the school visit had illustrated how effective programs could honor and build upon the existing wisdom within communities. Taken together, these experiences suggested a model of public engagement that prioritized authentic relationship building over formal protocol, that recognized the expertise and capabilities of the people being served, and that remained open to learning and adaptation based on real outcomes rather than predetermined assumptions. Catherine made notes about incorporating these insights into her upcoming advocacy work, particularly her continued support for the Growing Minds Initiative and other environmental education programs. She wanted to ensure that her royal patronage enhanced rather than overshadowed the genuine community leadership that made such programs successful. The afternoon mail included a formal thank you note from Oakwood Primary School, along with drawings and letters from students who had participated in the morning's activities. Catherine was particularly moved by a letter from Amara, the 8-year-old who had shared her grandmother's okra-growing wisdom. Dear Princess Catherine, Amara had written in careful handwriting, "Thank you for coming to see our garden. I hope you will tell other schools about growing food from their families' countries. My grandmother says that sharing knowledge about plants is how people take care of each other across time and distance. I think that's what you do too." Catherine read Amara's letter several times, struck by the child's sophisticated understanding of how knowledge sharing could function as a form of care and connection. The insight felt particularly relevant to Catherine's own role, which involved using her platform to connect different communities and initiatives in ways that might not otherwise occur. As the day concluded, Catherine prepared for the evening's engagement, a dinner with international environmental policy experts who were visiting London for a conference on climate change education. The dinner would provide an opportunity to share insights from her recent experiences with school environmental programs and to learn about innovative approaches being implemented in other countries. But first, Catherine wanted to spend time reflecting on the past 2 days' experiences and their implications for her ongoing work. She had been reminded repeatedly that effective public service required not just good intentions and adequate resources, but genuine understanding of how change actually occurred within communities and individual lives. The thread that connected Lily's wildflowers to James Morrison's bean plants to the Oakwood Primary Garden was the recognition that growth and development require consistent attention, respect for existing wisdom, and willingness to learn from unexpected sources. These principles applied equally to individual relationships, educational programs, and broader social change initiatives. Catherine realized that her most effective advocacy arose not from imposing her own agenda on various causes, but from listening carefully to the insights and needs expressed by the people most directly involved in important work. Her role was to amplify and connect existing efforts rather than to direct or control them. This understanding felt both humbling and empowering. It suggested that her unique position could be most valuable when used to facilitate connections and provide resources for initiatives that communities themselves identified as important, rather than promoting programs designed entirely by palace staff or policy experts. As Catherine prepared for the evening's international dinner, she looked forward to sharing stories about British environmental education initiatives while learning about approaches being developed elsewhere. The past 2 days had reminded her that the most effective solutions often emerge from combining local wisdom with broader networks of knowledge and support. The small thank you drawing from Lily Chun remained propped on Catherine's desk, a daily reminder that public service was ultimately about recognizing and responding to individual human needs with genuine care and attention. Everything else, the protocols, the programs, the policy initiatives, existed to support and amplify that fundamental commitment to treating each person as worthy of thoughtful consideration. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but Catherine felt confident that the insights from this remarkable two-day period would continue to inform and improve her approach to the privilege and responsibility of royal service. 3 months later, on a brilliant January morning, Catherine found herself returning to Kensington Gardens for her regular run. The winter landscape had transformed the familiar paths into something entirely different. Bare trees created intricate patterns against the pale sky, and frost-covered grass sparkled in the early sunlight like a carpet of diamonds. But as Catherine began her warm-up routine, she couldn't help but think about how much had changed since that pivotal October morning when she had encountered a lost little girl with crushed wildflowers. The Growing Minds initiative had exceeded all initial expectations. What had begun as a pilot program in 20 London schools had expanded to over 60 institutions across the country, with waiting lists that stretched into the hundreds. More significantly, the program had evolved in ways that reflected many of the insights Catherine had gained during those transformative days in autumn. The student leadership component that had emerged from her conversations with young environmental advocates had become the program's most distinctive and successful feature. Instead of adult-directed gardening lessons, Growing Minds now trained teenagers to serve as environmental education mentors, working with younger children to design and maintain school gardens that reflected the cultural diversity and specific interests of each school community. Eleanor appeared at Catherine's side with her usual impeccable timing, carrying a thermos of tea and the morning briefing folder. But today she also held a thick envelope that immediately caught Catherine's attention. "Ma,